There is a moment most people experience quietly when reaching the first $1,000 feels far more difficult than it logically should, as if the number itself carries a kind of resistance, even though, in purely mathematical terms, it is just a small step toward larger financial goals. What makes this moment interesting is not the amount, but the shift in behavior and perception that surrounds it. Because moving from 0 to 1,000 rarely feels smooth or predictable, and often feels disproportionately slow compared to what comes after. At a surface level, money should scale consistently, where each additional dollar requires roughly the same proportional effort. Yet in reality, the early phase behaves differently, because every dollar saved at the beginning competes directly with immediate needs, habits, and short-term comfort. When there is no financial buffer, saving is not just a calculation, it becomes a repeated decision where the present always feels more tangible than the future, and this makes each small act of saving feel heavier than it actually is. This creates a kind of friction that is constant and visible, because progress can be easily reversed. A single unexpected expense can undo days or even weeks of effort, which reinforces the feeling that building savings is fragile and slow. In this phase, money is entirely active, meaning it only moves when you actively decide to save it, and it disappears quickly when something demands it, leaving very little room for stability. Once the first 1,000 is reached, something subtle begins to change. Not dramatically, but enough to alter the system itself. That small amount starts to function as a buffer, and this reduces the pressure on each individual decision. Instead of every dollar being tied to immediate survival or consumption, some portion of money begins to exist as stored time and flexibility, and that changes how future decisions are made. From a mathematical perspective, the difference becomes clearer when looking at accumulation over time rather than isolated amounts. In the early stage, progress depends entirely on income minus expenses, which leaves little room for acceleration. But once a base exists, even small percentages begin to matter. The presence of savings reduces the likelihood of setbacks, and avoiding setbacks is often more important than making large gains in the beginning. This is where consistency starts to replace effort as the primary driver. When the system is less fragile, progress no longer resets as easily, and even modest contributions begin to stack in a more predictable way. The pace may still feel slow, but it becomes steadier, and that stability changes the psychological experience of saving. There is also a cognitive shift that happens once a baseline is established, because the brain begins to interpret saving differently. Instead of feeling like constant sacrifice, it starts to feel more like maintenance. Adding another $100 to an existing 1,000 feels fundamentally different from building that first 100 from zero, even though the action itself is the same. This reduces resistance and makes the behavior easier to repeat over time. Another important factor is optionality. Having even a small amount of savings introduces choices that did not previously exist, such as handling unexpected expenses without relying on debt, delaying decisions without immediate consequences, or simply having the ability to absorb small disruptions. These options reduce stress, and lower stress tends to improve decision-making, which in turn supports more consistent financial behavior. This pattern is not unique to individuals. Similar dynamics appear in larger economic systems, where the initial phase of building capital is often the most difficult, and once a base is established, growth becomes more stable and less dependent on constant effort. The rules of the system do not change, but the position within the system does, and that changes the outcomes over time. It is also important to recognize that reaching the first 1,000 is not equally difficult for everyone, because structural factors such as income, cost of living, and existing obligations create real constraints. The same milestone can feel trivial in one context and extremely challenging in another, which is why this threshold should be understood as a systems concept rather than a measure of personal ability. What makes this point meaningful is that it marks a transition from a purely reactive financial state to one that has a small degree of control. Money is no longer only something that passes through, it begins to stay, even if only briefly, and that changes how future decisions are framed. As progress continues beyond this stage, the relationship between effort and outcome becomes more favorable, not because the process becomes easy, but because the system starts to support forward movement instead of constantly resisting it. Early on, the challenge is overcoming instability, while later it becomes maintaining direction. In the end, the first $1,000 is not important because of its size, but because of what it represents. It is the point where financial behavior begins to shift from constant reaction to gradual control. And once that shift happens, progress, while still slow, no longer feels like starting over each time.